Imagine, if you will, taking a standard half-size violin and just detuning the strings.
Just cranking them right down.
Exactly. Detuning them until they're basically flapping around like loose laundry. And then you hand that instrument to a 5-year-old child and tell them, congratulations, you are now learning the viola.
Which is such a wild visual.
It really is. And I mean, to an outsider, that might look like a clever, pragmatic way to get a young student started on reading the alto clef early.
Right. It seems logical on the surface.
But to William Primrose, who is obviously one of the undisputed titans of 20th century string playing, this practice was not just a pedagogical misstep. It was like a cardinal sin.
Oh, absolutely.
He saw it as a fundamental betrayal of what the viola actually is.
Yeah, because it completely ignores the acoustic reality of the instrument. I mean, when you tune a violin down a fifth to mimic a viola, you are essentially stripping away the structural tension those strings require to speak properly.
Where the tension just gone.
Exactly. You aren't creating a miniature viola. You are creating an acoustically dead, sickly-sounding violin.
Sickly is such a great way to describe it.
Yeah, and as Primrose fiercely argued, teaching a child to produce a tone on a dead string, well, it guarantees they will never understand the profound, recalcitrant physical resistance that really defines true viola playing.
Which sets the stakes perfectly for what we are doing today. If you are tuning into this Viola Studio deep dive, whether you are a dedicated student, a seasoned performer, or maybe a teacher trying to guide the next generation of string players, you already know the struggle.
The eternal struggle.
Right. The viola is constantly fighting against the gravitational pull of the violin world. It is constantly misunderstood as just a big violin.
Which it is definitely not.
Not at all. So today, we are going straight to the source to dismantle that myth. We are cracking open David Dalton's revered text, Playing the Viola. Conversations with William Primrose.
Such a phenomenal book.
It really is the Bible for this stuff. And we are zeroing in on one of the most provocative, densely packed chapters in the entire thing, which is titled Viola via Violin.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
There's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
Primrose doesn't just offer abstract philosophy here. He provides a real mechanical and psychological blueprint. He establishes that the viola is a completely unique beast.
A completely different animal.
Yeah. It requires a specific breed of genuine, or as he terms it, echt musicians, people who understand how to coax sound out of a uniquely demanding acoustic box.
But, and here is the massive contradiction that made me immediately stop and reread the first page of this chapter.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right, because Primrose spends his entire life arguing that the viola is fundamentally distinct from the violin.
Yep.
The mechanics of tone production are different, the physical resistance is different, the soul of the instrument is different. So, logically, you would assume he wants purists.
You'd think he'd want people who only ever played the viola.
Exactly. You would assume he wants students who started on the viola from day one, completely untainted by violin technique. But instead, he drops this pedagogical bombshell. He vastly prefers students who come to the viola by way of the violin.
It feels counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It really feels hypocritical on the surface.
I mean, why champion the distinct nature of the ek violist only to recruit your students from the violin section?
Exactly. Make it make sense.
Well, the answer comes down to sheer athletic pragmatism. Primrose states unequivocally that he prefers a pupil coming via the violin because their left-hand technique is already in a highly advanced state of conditioning.
Okay, but let me push back on that immediately.
Sure, go for it.
Because we are told constantly in string pedagogy that early localized muscle memory is everything.
Right. The early years are crucial.
Yeah. So if you wait until a player is, say, 18 to hand them a viola, aren't you losing over a decade of instrument-specific conditioning? I mean, the angles are wider, the string length is longer, the physical weight of the instrument is entirely different.
Oh, the physical demands are huge.
So how does a fast left hand built on a violin compensate for missing those critical formative years on the actual instrument?
Well, that assumes the early viola repertoire provides the necessary physical stress testing to actually build a virtuoso left hand.
Oh, interesting.
And historically, it simply hasn't. In the text, Dalton brings up a theory by another legendary violist, Walter Trampler.
The Trampler agreement.
Yes, and Primrose wholly endorses this. Trampler observed that original violists, meaning those who started purely on the viola, almost universally suffer from a sluggish left hand.
A sluggish hand. Wow.
Yeah, so Trampler believed his students were infinitely better off if they played the violin right up to the benchmark of, like, Mozart concertos, the Wieniawski D minor, or Lalo's Symphonie Espagnole before they ever even touched a viola.
And looking at those specific benchmarks, the logic becomes brutally clear.
It really does.
If you are playing the Wieniawski D minor concerto, you are executing fingered octaves, rapid-fire tenths, and these lightning-fast shifts into the upper stratosphere of the fingerboard.
You are forcing the hand into the absolute extreme limits of human dexterity.
Exactly. The foundational early to intermediate viola repertoire simply doesn't demand those fireworks.
It doesn't force the hand into the gym, so to speak. A student who plays only the viola from childhood might develop a beautiful, warm tone, but their fingers are rarely asked to move with acrobatic velocity.
Which is a huge disadvantage later on.
Absolutely. And beyond just a lack of rigorous repertoire, Primrose identifies a deeper, almost neurological issue at play here.
Right, the psychological quirk.
Yes. He observes this quirk in original violists where they are inherently apt to play on the slow side, regardless of the music in front of them.
The slow hand syndrome.
Yeah.
And Primrose illustrates this with an analogy that, honestly, it completely changed how I visualize string playing.
It's a brilliant analogy.
He compares these original violists to organists who are asked to play the piano.
The mechanics of that comparison are just spot on. Consider the physical process of playing a pipe organ. When the organist depresses a key, they aren't directly striking a string.
Right, it's a whole mechanical process.
Exactly. They are triggering a relay opening a valve, allowing air to travel through a massive pipe, which eventually produces a pitch. There is a tangible, albeit microscopic, delay between the physical action of the finger and the acoustic result.
So there's a built-in lag. The instrument inherently teaches the player's brain to wait.
Exactly that. Primrose noted that when he performed with organists who were accompanying him on the piano, their playing always felt slightly behind.
Just a little sluggish.
Yeah, because on a piano, the hammer strikes the string the millisecond, the key is pressed, the sound is instantaneous. But the organist's brain is still operating on a delay.
They hit the key and subconsciously wait for the pipe to speak.
Yes, and Primrose maps this exact acoustic lag onto the viola.
Because the viola string is thicker, lower in tension, and carries more physical mass than a violin string.
Substantially more mass, yeah.
So when you press a finger down and draw the bow, that heavy C string does not speak instantaneously like a high-tension violin E string. It requires a microsecond of traction to set that mass into vibration.
And the violist's brain subconsciously learns to accommodate that acoustic delay.
Wow.
If a student grows up exclusively playing the viola, their central nervous system essentially programs a lag into their left hand to match the recalcitrance of the string. They learn to be slow.
That is fascinating.
So by importing a violinist who has been playing Wieniawski, Primrose bypasses that neurological programming entirely.
Because the violinist's left hand is accustomed to the instant gratification of a tight steel string.
Exactly. Their fingers fly without hesitation.
Okay, so Primrose gets this prepackaged, hyper-agile left hand. But borrowing a violinist's left hand means you also inherit a violinist's habits.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a free lunch.
Right, which brings us to the mechanical faults that have to be ruthlessly ironed out during the switch.
Mm.
And the most obvious one Primrose mentions is the aversion to open strings.
Yes. Violin pedagogy often drills into students a deep fear of the open E and A strings during lyrical passages.
Which makes sense because an open steel E string on a violin can sound really piercing.
Overly bright, yeah. And entirely disconnected from the covered, vibrato-rich sound of a stop string. So violinists habitually cross strings and use their fourth finger to avoid the open strings, creating a homogeneous line.
Which is a beautiful technique on the violin.
It is. But Primrose has to constantly interrupt his converts and demand they use the open strings.
Right, because the viola is inherently darker, more muted, and it naturally struggles to project through an orchestra.
Exactly. Those open strings on a viola aren't piercing at all. They are incredibly sonorous.
They ring.
They add a vital, ringing, sympathetic resonance to the instrument. If you finger a viola like a violin, you actively choke the instrument's natural projection.
But fingering choices are, that's a relatively simple mechanical habit to rewrite, right?
Oh, compared to the bow arm. Definitely.
Right. Because the far more treacherous pedagogical pitfall, the thing that Primrose finds nearly impossible to fix in some converts, brings us right back to our 5-year-old child with the detuned violin.
The right arm. The physical sensation of tone production.
This is where Primrose's contempt for those preschool teaching organizers really boils over. He calls that tuned-down violin a sickly instrument with droopy strings.
And he's not wrong.
We touched on this in the intro, but let's really dissect the physics of why this is so damaging. If you tune a violin down a fifth, you rob the string of tension. What happens to the right arm when it encounters a string with no resistance?
Well, the bow arm just learns to skate.
To skate, yeah.
True viola tone production requires the bow hair to really dig in, to grip the thick gauge of the string, and to pull the mass of the wood into vibration.
It's a completely different feeling.
It is. It requires an incredibly specific transfer of arm weight into the string without crushing it. If a child spends years drawing a bow across a floppy, low-tension string, they never develop the muscular sensation of traction.
Right. They never feel the resistance of a true viola string pushing back against the bow hair. They're essentially shadowboxing instead of hitting a heavy bag.
That perfectly encapsulates it. Shadowboxing. Primrose insists that the subtle, profound distinctions in tone production between the violin and the viola cannot be perceived, let alone mastered, unless the student is working with something that at least approximates a full-size viola.
So sacrificing the physical art of tone production merely for the intellectual convenience of teaching a 5-year-old the alto clef early.
It's a catastrophic trade-off.
Which forces us to confront a very uncomfortable physical reality. If a 5-year-old is simply too small to hold a real viola, and a tuned-down violin ruins their bow arm, we are fundamentally dealing with an instrument that requires a certain physical maturity.
Yes.
The viol is larger, it's heavier, and the intervals are wider. This naturally leads to that pervasive myth that you must have a massive lumberjack-sized hand to play the instrument.
Ah, the mythical viola hand.
Yeah. Yes. It is a ubiquitous assumption in string circles that physical stature and handspan act as this gatekeeper to the viola fraternity.
And Primrose addresses this head-on. I mean, he does concede that possessing a large hand and being of medium to large physical stature is an undeniable advantage.
Sure, it just makes things easier.
Right. It simply makes navigating the physical bulk of the instrument less taxing. But he forcefully rejects the notion that a massive hand is a strict requirement.
And he provides incredibly vivid examples to debunk this. He specifically highlights women of smaller stature with, as he puts it, smallish hands, who simply refuse to be denied the instrument.
Which is so inspiring.
It is. He mentions a young Japanese student with very small hands who executed the most grueling virtuoso viola repertoire flawlessly.
And he contextualizes this by looking outside the viola world entirely, pointing to Joseph Hoffman.
Oh, the pianist?
Right. Hoffman is a fascinating historical parallel here. He was one of the greatest piano virtuosos of his era, yet his handspan was notoriously small. Yeah. He couldn't reach the massive chords demanded by much of the Romantic piano literature in a traditional static hand position.
So how did he do it?
Well, through sheer kinetic intelligence, lateral speed, and microscopic adaptations in his technique, he played everything. The human anatomy is staggeringly adaptable when it's guided by a brilliant musical mind.
Primrose also mentions watching a 12-year-old girl perform a Paganini violin concerto.
Oh, the story is wild.
It's crazy. Her arms and hands were so small that when she shifted into the highest registers of the fingerboard, her thumb couldn't remain anchored on the neck or even the top rib of the violin.
Yeah, her thumb physically had to leave the neck and rest on top of the instrument's belly just so her fingers could reach the notes.
Which violates every fundamental rule of traditional string pedagogy.
Any conservatory jury watching her left thumb floating over the instrument would have had a collective stroke.
Absolutely. But she executed Paganini. Right. Primrose uses this to illustrate that technique is not a rigid set of physiological rules. Technique is whatever physical adaptation is required to serve the music.
Let's look at Primrose's own hands, though.
Yeah, Dalton actually includes photographs in the text, right?
Yeah.
Figures 1A and 1B.
Exactly. And he asks Primrose to analyze his own physical endowment.
What does the visual evidence show?
Well, it's telling. Primrose's hand was not exceptionally long. It wasn't that spindly, spider-like hand people often associate with string players.
Right, the typical violinist hand.
Yeah, instead, his hand was noticeably broad across the palm. And most crucially, he points out that his fingers were relatively equal in length, which provided an immense advantage for uniform weight distribution on the fingerboard.
But even with that broad hand, he openly admits he is not a master of playing tenths on the viola.
No, he says he struggles with them.
A tenth requires the hand to stretch across an enormous span of the fingerboard. Primrose says he seldom uses them, and when forced to, he merely manages them.
Which is so refreshing to hear.
To hear one of the greatest violists of the century admit that tenths are a struggle is a massive relief. If hand size didn't stop William Primrose, it shouldn't stop any aspiring student.
He asserts that he rarely, if ever, discouraged an applicant from studying the viola due to a lack of physical stature. Hand size was never the deal breaker for Primrose.
Okay, then what was the deal breaker? Because he did turn people away. If someone walked into his studio with Wieniawski-level left-hand speed, a willingness to fix their bow arm, and no fear of the physical size of the instrument, what could possibly make Primrose tell a violinist they were fundamentally unfit for the viola?
A frantic, uncontrollable vibrato.
Really?
That was the singular fault that caused Primrose to actively dissuade a violinist from attempting the switch.
A fast vibrato. I mean, on the violin, a fast, shimmering vibrato is often highly prized. Why is it fatal on the viola?
It comes down to the immutable laws of acoustics and string mass.
Okay, lay it on me.
Vibrato is basically a rhythmic oscillation of pitch. To produce a warm, resonant sound, that oscillation needs to activate the entire core of the string. Now, a viola string possesses significantly more mass than a violin string.
Right, it's a lot thicker.
Exactly. If a player uses a hyper-fast, tight, nervous vibrato where the finger is merely twitching rapidly on the surface of the string, it fails to move the mass of the wood. The oscillation is too fast and too shallow to engage the lower resonant frequencies of the instrument.
Oh, it's like trying to ring a massive church bell by tapping it rapidly with a tiny hammer.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
You might get a lot of surface noise, but the bell itself will never swing, and the deep fundamental tone will never ring out. You have to pull the heavy rope slowly and widely to get the mass moving.
Exactly. The viola requires a slightly wider, marginally slower vibrato to coax the richness out of the wood. Primrose found that if a violinist's neuromuscular habit of a frantic, tight vibrato was so deeply ingrained that they physically could not slow it down and widen it, they would forever choke the instrument.
It would just sound awful.
The viola would sound neurotic, strangled, and thin. I mean, fingerings can be relearned, bow weight can be adjusted, but an immutable nervous vibrato is fundamentally incompatible with the soul of the instrument.
The soul of the instrument. That phrase captures the philosophical core of Primrose's teaching. When Dalton asks him why a violinist should switch in the first place, Primrose acknowledges the economic reality, right?
Sure, less competition.
Yeah, there are more orchestra jobs available for violists than violinists. But he quickly pivots to what he calls loftier reasons.
He utilizes intensely spiritual, almost religious vocabulary here. He seeks students who are drawn to the specific tonal color of the viola, who have a keen, undeniable desire to produce that unique sound. He welcomes these students into what he calls the fraternity.
But the fraternity demands absolute loyalty.
Oh, yeah. No going back.
He warns that once a player has seen the light, they must never revert to their impious ways. They must never look back to their prior sinfulness, meaning the violin.
I love how dramatic he is about it.
You cannot treat the viola as a part-time hobby or a backup plan. You have to commit to mastering its recalcitrance.
And mastering the instrument mentally and physically is only half the battle.
Right.
The other half is acquiring a piece of wood that actually cooperates with you, which plunges us into the chaotic, unregulated market of buying a viola.
Yes. When Dalton asks for advice on selecting an instrument, Primrose doesn't offer a polite checklist. He invokes the Latin phrase, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware.
It's brutal out there.
Buying a viola is the Wild West compared to the relatively standardized world of the violin.
The economics of lutherie make it a treacherous landscape. Historically, a promising student might have been able to afford a historical masterwork. Primrose notes that at one time, a viola by the great 19th century French maker Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume was within a reasonable financial grasp.
But those days are long gone.
Long gone. The inflation of historical instruments has forced nearly all students to seek out contemporary makers.
Primrose mentions that during his time, a high-quality contemporary viola started around $3,000.
Which was a lot back then.
Right. For anyone listening today, adjust that for decades of inflation, and you are looking at a massive financial investment for a modern instrument.
Absolutely.
But what I find fascinating is Primrose's description of what happens after you write the check. He says buying a new contemporary viola initiates a husband and wife relationship.
It is a profound description of the break-in period. A new instrument is not a finished product the day it leaves the luthier's bench.
It's not ready to go right away.
Not at all. The wood is still settling. The varnish is still curing and hardening. When you purchase a contemporary viola, Primrose warns that it will take 2 to 3 years of daily, rigorous playing for the instrument to truly begin to sound.
Okay, so what is physically happening during those 2 to 3 years? Why does it take so long?
Well, the constant, intense vibrations from the strings being played actually alter the physical structure of the spruce and maple.
Really? It changes the wood.
Yes. The cellular structure of the wood begins to align and adapt to the specific resonant frequencies being pumped through it. Sap crystallizes. The physical box literally opens up and becomes more responsive.
That is incredible.
But simultaneously, the player is adapting too. The violist subconsciously adjusts their bow pressure, alters their contact point near the bridge, and modulates their vibrato to coax the optimal resonance out of that specific piece of wood.
So it is a dual metamorphosis. The player and the instrument physically mold to one another.
Exactly. But before you can embark on that marriage, you have to survive the dealers.
Oh boy.
Primrose is wonderfully cynical about the showroom experience. He warns students about a specific acoustic illusion engineered by dealers.
He learned this through bitter experience, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He would visit highly respected dealers, and they would place him in a specific room to try out an instrument. And miraculously, every viola he picked up sounded like a Stradivarius.
He compares it to the automotive world. He notes that if a dealer is trying to sell you a Rolls-Royce, they aren't going to park it in a dimly lit coal cellar.
Of course not.
They put it in a pristine, brilliantly lit showroom to maximize its appeal. Instrument dealers do the exact same thing with room acoustics.
They utilize small rooms with hardwood floors, plaster walls, and hard ceilings. These environments are intensely reverberant.
They just bounce everything back.
Exactly. They catch every frequency and bounce it back to the player's ear, making even a mediocre, dull-sounding viola feel incredibly responsive, rich, and powerful under the chin.
But Primrose would purchase these instruments, carry them into a massive concert hall, and discover that the sound completely died before it reached the fifth row.
The instrument had no core. The room had been doing all the work.
So how does a student circumvent this trap?
Primrose demands that you secure a trial period. You take the instrument out of the showroom and into an acoustically dead room, a space heavily dampened with thick carpets, heavy drapes, and plush furniture.
So a room that offers no help at all.
Right. A dead room absorbs sound. It offers the instrument zero acoustic assistance. If a viola can still produce a dense, resonant, complex tone in a dead room, it possesses genuine acoustic power.
And then you test the projection.
From there, you take it into a large, empty auditorium to test its true projection capabilities over a distance.
But testing the tone is only relevant if the instrument actually fits the player's body. And this is where the lack of standardization in the viola world creates absolute chaos.
Chaos is the right word.
Violins have a universally accepted full size. Violas do not. Primrose points out that violas range anywhere from a diminutive 15 and 34 inches in body length all the way up to a monstrous 17 and 34 inches.
That is a staggering 2-inch variance in body length.
Which is massive.
It exponentially increases the vibrating string lengths, the spacing between the notes, and the physical weight the left arm must support.
So how do you find the right fit? You can't just hand a 17-inch viola to a student and hope their shoulders survive the year.
No, that's a recipe for injury. Primrose provides 2 very practical ergonomic tests for teachers and students. The first is a simple reach test.
Okay, how does that work?
The student places the instrument in playing position under the chin. They must then reach out with their left hand and grasp the scroll of the instrument. If they cannot grasp the scroll with relative ease and a slight bend in the elbow, the instrument is simply too long.
That's a great, simple metric. And the second test?
The second test is a measure of finger span, forming a tetrachord on the C string.
The lowest string.
Yes. The student places their hand in first position on the lowest, thickest string, the C string, and forms a 4-note diatonic scale pattern, keeping all 4 fingers pressed down simultaneously.
Which is a huge stretch.
It requires the widest finger spread at the furthest, most awkward angle. If the hand locks up, or if the stretch causes acute pain or tension, the string length is unmanageable.
Makes sense.
They must also be able to comfortably navigate into the higher positions near the body of the instrument, which are mandatory for modern virtuoso repertoire.
While the range of sizes is vast, Primrose does identify his own ideal sweet spot. He establishes a latitude between 16 inches and 17 and 14 inches. He firmly believes that within this specific dimensional window, the true, authentic tone of the viola resides.
And that dimensional window is critical because falling outside of it triggers the ultimate acoustic nightmare of string instrument construction.
The internal tension.
Exactly. The physical size of the viola directly dictates the internal tension of the instrument.
The eternal struggle of the C string versus the A string. Primrose describes this as the great puzzle for string makers. Over and above all the complexities of crafting a violin, producing a viola involves a brutal, zero-sum acoustic trade-off.
It is an architectural balancing act. Luthiers constantly find that if they carve and graduate the wood to produce a brilliantly resonant, singing A string, the highest string, the thick, lowest C string often becomes muddy, unresponsive, and tubby.
And vice versa, right?
Exactly. If they optimize the belly of the instrument to accommodate the massive, slow vibrations of the C string, the A string often turns shrill and nasal. It is incredibly difficult to balance the tension across the top plate.
Which brings us to the Sleeping Princess anecdote, which is perhaps my favorite story in the entire text, because it so perfectly illustrates how fragile and interconnected this acoustic ecosystem is.
It's a great story.
Primrose purchases an extraordinary Andrea Guarneri viola.
A magnificent historical instrument. And in almost every respect, the tone was utterly satisfying. The A, D, and G strings sang beautifully. But Primrose, with his exacting standards, was slightly disappointed in the C string.
It just wasn't doing it for him.
Right. It lacked the depth and immediate response he required.
So he takes this masterpiece to Simone Fernando Sacconi. For those who don't know, Sacconi was arguably the greatest luthier and restorer of the 20th century.
He was a genius.
He was the guy who maintained the most famous Stradivarius instruments in the world. So Primrose and Sacconi are agonizing over this Guarneri, trying to figure out why the C string is choked. And Primrose suggests an experiment. He says, suppose I try a gut A string instead of the steel string that is presently on it.
And Primrose notes that upon hearing the suggestion, Sacconi nearly embraced him.
He was thrilled.
Sacconi was a purist deeply rooted in the classical Italian traditions of Cremona, and he viewed modern steel strings as an absolute abomination.
So they remove the high-tension steel A string, replace it with a traditional lower-tension gut A string, and Primrose says within days, the bottom C string began to open up like a sleeping princess.
It is a beautiful poetic image.
It is. But let's translate that into physics. Why does changing the material of the highest string suddenly awaken the lowest string on the opposite side of the fingerboard?
It is entirely about downward pressure on the bridge. A steel string requires a tremendous amount of pulling tension to reach its designated pitch compared to a gut string.
It's wound much tighter.
Yes. That longitudinal tension translates into intense downward pressure on the right side of the bridge, which rests directly on the spruce top or belly of the viola.
The belly is essentially being clamped down by the steel string.
Exactly. The spruce wood is being physically squeezed under the immense pressure of the steel. In order for the thick C string to produce its low, booming frequencies, the entire top plate of the instrument needs to undulate and vibrate in large, slow waves.
But it can't do that if it's clamped.
Right. If the right side of the bridge is clamped down by the steel A string, it restricts the mobility of the entire belly. The wood cannot move freely.
Wow.
By swapping the steel for gut, Primrose significantly reduced the downward pressure. The clamping effect was released. The spruce top could finally breathe, flex, and resonate, allowing the C string to fully awaken.
It perfectly demonstrates that a string instrument is not just a collection of independent strings. It is a single, hypersensitive, interconnected system.
A delicate ecosystem.
But this sparks a much larger debate within the text regarding string materials, the gut versus steel debate. Because despite the Sleeping Princess revelation, Primrose admits that for a significant portion of his career, he actually played on steel strings, largely under the influence of Lionel Tertis.
Yes, Tertis was a massive proponent of steel strings, and we have to acknowledge their practical superiority.
They are definitely more practical.
Steel strings are incredibly stable. They hold their pitch in fluctuating humidity and temperature. They last exponentially longer than gut before snapping.
And they don't get false fifths, right?
Exactly. They are highly resistant to developing false fifths, which is a maddening condition where a gut string wears unevenly and no longer plays perfectly in tune across the fingerboard. And importantly, Primrose notes that steel strings sound very prudent under the ear of the player. They provide a clean, focused, immediate response.
But if they're more reliable, more durable, and sound great to the person playing them, why did Primrose eventually develop such a strong aversion to them as a listener?
Because the sound of steel under the ear does not accurately reflect how that sound propagates through a concert hall.
Ah, the projection is different.
Primrose describes sitting in the audience, listening to colleagues who strung their violas entirely with steel, and the acoustic impression was deeply unsettling. He likened the sound to a person having his or her throat constricted and then being asked to sing.
A constricted throat. That implies a sound that is loud but completely lacking in depth.
Precisely. Steel strings can produce a very aggressive, penetrating fundamental frequency, but they often lack the complex web of overtones, the harmonic richness that gut strings naturally produce.
So it just sounds thin from far away.
From 30 rows back, an all-steel viola can sound thin, tight, and strangled, lacking the blooming warmth that is the hallmark of the instrument. Primrose vastly preferred the complex color of gut, although he laments that later in his career, the quality of available gut strings deteriorated so severely that he was forced to compromise and use wound strings.
This eternal compromise between projection, tonal color, and physical manageability is the defining narrative of the viola. It is an instrument constantly at war with its own physics.
That's a great way to put it.
To project the low frequencies of the C string optimally, the acoustic box theoretically needs to be massive, which leads to the great size debate. Dalton brings up the infamous conductor Leopold Stokowski, who had very specific, extreme ideas about what the viola section should look like.
Stokowski was a sonic architect obsessed with generating immense, rich orchestral sonorities. He looked at the standard viola, recognized its acoustic compromises, and demanded that his Philadelphia orchestra viola section switch to what he termed a tenorgage, or tenor violin.
Which is essentially a small cello.
Pretty much.
It was so large it had to be played resting vertically on a peg between the knees rather than tucked under the chin.
Purely from the standpoint of acoustic physics, Stokowski was entirely correct.
Technically, yeah.
To naturally amplify the frequencies of the viola range without the muffled compromise of a smaller box, the instrument needs to be roughly that size. It needs the air volume and the surface area to support the C string.
But you can't just walk into a section of highly trained professional violists and tell them to abandon 30 years of neuromuscular conditioning under the chin.
You'd have a riot on your hands.
Right. Primrose points out that if Stokowski had forcefully mandated the tenorgage, he would have faced a full-scale orchestral mutiny. You cannot sever the player's physical relationship with the instrument for the sake of theoretical acoustic perfection.
Lionel Tertis attempted to solve this conundrum from a different angle.
Oh, Tertis and his huge viola.
Right. Tertis famously played a monstrously large Montagnana viola specifically to access that booming, cavernous sound. But Tertis himself was a small man with proportionately short arms.
That sounds incredibly painful.
It was. He subjected himself to agonizing physical strain for years to wrangle that instrument until his body simply broke down and he could no longer manage the pain.
So Tertis collaborated on a new design, right? The Tertis-Richardson model.
Yes, he worked with luthier Arthur Richardson to design an instrument that possessed the massive internal air volume and wide bouts necessary for deep sonority, but with altered proportions such as sloping shoulders to make the string length and reach more manageable for players of average stature.
Did it revolutionize the viola world? Did everyone switch to the Tertis model?
Primrose views it as an important developmental step, but no, it did not achieve universal adoption.
Why not?
Well, this highlights a fundamental aesthetic divergence between Tertis and Primrose regarding the very soul of the viola sound. Tertis actively sought out a deeply dark, thick contralto sonority, heavily influenced by the early, massive Gasparo da Salo prototypes. He wanted the viola to sound like a baritone or a deep contralto singer.
Whereas Primrose preferred a lighter, more penetrating color.
Exactly. Primrose favored the acoustic profile of the Stradivarius and Andrea Scorneri models. He stated a clear preference for the mezzo-soprano quality in the viola's voice.
So he wanted it to sing higher?
He wanted an instrument that possessed warmth on the bottom, but retained a brilliant, singing, highly agile upper register. This aesthetic, perfectly aligns with his preference for converting violinists.
Because if you want violin agility, a huge box won't work.
Right. If you want a mezzo-soprano instrument capable of executing Wieniawski-level acrobatics, a massive, booming contralto box is going to fight you every step of the way.
That aesthetic choice defines Primrose's entire pedagogical philosophy. He wants the agility of the violin paired with the mezzo-soprano soul of the viola.
That's the dream combination.
But achieving that synthesis requires crossing a massive intellectual bridge. We've talked extensively about the physical and acoustic hurdles, but Section 5 of the outline forces us to confront the mental rewiring required to play this instrument.
Because historically, the viola was never intended to be a virtuoso vehicle.
Not at all.
Primrose notes that during the 16th and 17th centuries, the older, larger violas were utilized almost exclusively for harmonic filler doubling choral voices or padding the middle of an ensemble.
They were just playing whole notes.
The physical demands were negligible. He highly doubts those early players ever ventured much beyond third position on the fingerboard.
They were just sitting comfortably in the lower half of the neck, churning out harmony. But today, the demands are astronomical. Composers treat the viola as a fully realized solo instrument.
Modern violists are required to scamper across the entire length of the fingerboard, executing complex gymnastics on an instrument that is physically cumbersome, all while translating a completely different language. The alto clef.
The C clef, where middle C is anchored precisely on the middle line of the five-line staff. For a violinist converting to the viola, this is the great intellectual barrier.
It breaks their brains a little bit.
It really does. Their brain is hardwired to read the treble clef, where that middle line is a B. Suddenly, every note they look at is shifted.
Dalton asks Primrose how he navigates teaching this to new students, and Primrose hilariously deflects.
He just avoids the question entirely.
He admits his own memory is dimmed beyond recall. He has known the alto clef for so long, he genuinely cannot remember how he learned it. So Dalton, the co-author, steps in and provides his own incredibly practical visual method for mastering the transition.
And Dalton's method is a psychological lifesaver for any transitioning student listening right now.
Oh, it's brilliant!
He vehemently opposes the brute force method of just handing a student a viola method book and telling them to figure it out by playing.
That's how a lot of people try to do it, and it's terrible.
Right. Instead, he begins purely graphically. He has the student visualize the grand staff, the treble clef on top, the bass clef on the bottom, exactly as it appears on a piano score.
Which most musicians already know.
Exactly. He then superimposes the alto clef directly in the middle, demonstrating visually how it bridges the gap between the two familiar clefs, pivoting around middle C.
It instantly demystifies the clef by anchoring it in the geography of the piano, which almost all musicians already understand.
Once the visual logic is established, Dalton assigns rigorous mental exercises. The student takes blank staff paper and locates the 4 open strings of the viola in the new clef. For several days, they do not touch the instrument.
They aren't allowed to play at all.
Nope. They randomly fill in the intervals between the open strings with notes, mentally calculating the fingerings in first position. They are mapping the geography in their mind without the distraction of physical execution.
Then he flips the process. He takes a printed score, points to random notes in the alto clef, and demands the student instantly name the note and the physical fingering.
Talk about a workout.
Only after this intense mental conditioning is complete does he allow the student to pick up the instrument and introduce etudes in various positions. Dalton insists that the intellectual groundwork must be impenetrable.
You can't be translating on the fly.
Exactly. The modern violist must be so facile in mind and sight that they can instantaneously switch back and forth between the alto and treble clefs, as modern viola music frequently utilizes both without a microsecond of hesitation.
This intense mental mapping, this requirement to hold multiple clefs and complex harmonic structures in your head simultaneously, brings us to a wonderfully humorous observation about the inherent intellect of the violist.
Oh, the Culloden quote.
Yes. Dalton quotes the perceptive music critic Irving Culloden, and it is perhaps the most satisfying quote in the book for any violist who has endured viola jokes from their colleagues.
The Culloden quote brilliantly captures the sociological dynamic of a string section.
Culloden writes that as a fledgling viola player, he observed his colleagues and concluded that all violists were inherently studious chaps.
Studious chaps.
And he contrasts them with first violinists, whom he famously categorizes as agile notenfressers.
Notenfressers, note eaters, note gluttons.
It is such a devastatingly accurate caricature. The violinists are portrayed as these athletic machines, blindly gobbling up millions of notes with their lightning-fast fingers, riding the melody. But the violists, these studious chaps sitting in the middle of the orchestra, might not possess that raw, gluttonous finger facility, but according to Culloden, they are better read, have heard more music, and are altogether men of superior taste.
The humor masks a very profound musical truth, though.
How so?
Well, when you play the melody, as a first violinist typically does, you can often rely on sheer instinct and physical facility. You are singing the tune. But when you play an inner voice, you are the harmonic glue.
You have to know how everything fits together.
A violist must constantly analyze how their notes intersect with the bass line and the melody. They must understand the structural architecture of the chord. They have to read the entire score, not just their isolated part. This inherently develops a broader, more sophisticated musical palette.
Primrose enthusiastically endorses this glimpse of the obvious. He revels in the intellectual superiority of the fraternity. When Dalton mentions his own book, Technique is Memory, which was published using only the treble clef, Primrose waves off the need for a transposed viola edition. He jokes that transposing a fifth down on the fly while sight reading is mere child's play to those of such superior intelligence.
He fiercely defends the intellectual rigor required to master the instrument. And it is precisely this fierce protectiveness, this deep respect for the hard-fought mastery of the true violist, that fuels his absolute outrage in Section 6, the moonlighting controversy.
This is where the conversation turns highly contentious. Primrose looks at the culture of string playing and sees a trend that infuriates him. But to understand his anger, we have to look at the historical context.
Right, you have to know where he's coming from.
Dalton brings up Louis Kievman, who describes the reality of attending Juilliard before World War II. Kievman recounts that all violinists at Juilliard were required to learn the viola, but Juilliard didn't actually employ a dedicated viola instructor.
They were just expected to figure it out.
The violinists were simply expected to fumble through it on their own to fulfill a requirement.
The viola was treated as a secondary chore, an afterthought. However, Dalton points out that the educational landscape has shifted dramatically. Most major music conservatories now have dedicated world-class viola professors, and they strictly mandate that violin students take formal instruction on the instrument.
Dalton asks Primrose if he approves of forcing violinists to study the viola. Primrose gives a wonderfully dry response. Well, it purifies their souls.
He fundamentally believes that engaging with the inner voices of the repertoire is musically enriching. He actively encourages violinists to sit down in a living room and read a Haydn or Mozart string quartet on the viola.
It's good for them.
It broadens their harmonic understanding. He is perfectly happy for them to have their fun in private.
But the moment that violinist steps out of the living room and onto a concert stage with a viola in their hands, Primrose draws a vicious line in the sand.
Oh, he does not tolerate it.
When Dalton asks him about famous, established solo violinists who occasionally present themselves to the public as viola soloists, Primrose erupts. He labels them moonlighting violists, and he views their actions as an existential threat to the profession.
To understand his fury, you must recognize the historical battle Primrose fought. Throughout the early and mid-20th century, Primrose, along with Lionel Curtis, waged a grueling, relentless campaign to legitimize the viola as a premier solo instrument.
They were pioneers.
They fought against a deeply entrenched, apathetic public perception that viewed the viola as incapable of sustaining a solo career.
They spent decades clearing the brush and building the stage. And now, these highly distinguished violinists who already enjoy lucrative careers, who don't need the money, and who gain no significant reputational boost from playing the viola, casually pick up the instrument on a weekend and parade themselves as viola soloists. Primrose views this as an egregious act of trespassing.
It is a usurpation of opportunity. When a famous violinist takes a concerto date on the viola, they are actively stealing stage time, critical attention, and oxygen from the young, aspiring violists.
The people who actually need those gigs.
The genuine practitioners who have dedicated their entire lives to mastering the specific recalcitrance of the instrument and who desperately need those platforms to build legitimate careers. The moonlighters treat the viola as a novelty act, but they perform it in the public square, displacing the true heirs of the instrument.
The economic displacement is bad enough, but the artistic damage is far worse. Primrose argues that because the viola is still relatively young as a solo instrument, the general public has not yet internalized a universally recognized standard for how it should sound.
That is the core vulnerability. If a pianist walks on stage and butchers a Beethoven sonata, the audience knows the pianist is at fault.
Right. Everyone knows what a piano should sound like.
The standard for piano playing is firmly established in the public ear. But if a famous violinist walks on stage and produces a thin, strangled, nervous tone on a viola, the audience lacks the acoustic reference point to identify it as bad playing.
Which leads to the Hindemith disaster.
Mm.
Primrose recounts attending a gathering where a violinist, and he pointedly uses the derogatory term fiddler, here decided to publicly perform Paul Hindemith's monumental viola concerto, Der Schwanendreher.
The Schwanendreher is a titan of the repertoire. It demands immense physical stamina, a massive muscular core tone, and deep understanding of the viola's resonance to project Hindemith's dense orchestration.
And according to Primrose, the violinist's performance was a complete disgrace.
A total train wreck.
The player utilized a frantic violin vibrato, lacked the right arm weight to pull the sound, and fundamentally choked the instrument. It was a technical and acoustic failure.
But the tragedy lies in the audience's reaction. Because the listeners lacked a codified standard for viola excellence, they did not conclude that the violinist was incompetent.
They blamed the instrument.
Instead, as Primrose noted with despair, the audience walked away thinking that the viola is simply a poor, ineffective solo instrument. Or worse, they concluded that Hindemith's Der Schwanendreher is a wretched, ugly piece of music.
The moonlighting violinist's hubris actively sabotages the public perception of the instrument and its greatest repertoire. The violinist plays terribly, but the viola and the composer take the blame. It devalues the currency of every genuine violist trying to make a living.
Dalton recognizes the severity of the problem and asks Primrose for a solution. How do you combat this trespassing?
And what does Primrose say?
Primrose, entirely exasperated, offers a darkly comedic response. Perhaps shoot all violinists who play viola publicly.
It is a shocking, hilarious display of his frustration. But Dalton pivots off that dark humor to articulate the true, enduring solution. He notes that eliminating the moonlighters creates a vacuum, and a vacuum doesn't advance the instrument.
Dalton states that taking the place of these deceased moonlighters must be a relentless wave of act violists.
An army of them.
The only way to permanently end the trespassing is to raise an army of genuine, deeply dedicated players who perform the viola precisely as it was meant to be played, with profound resonance, intelligent vibrato, and undeniable virtuosity.
You defeat the moonlighters by rendering them obsolete. You establish a standard of excellence so remarkably high, so tonally devastating and technically secure that the public ear becomes educated.
Once the audience knows what a true viola sounds like, a violinist will never again be able to pick it up on a whim and fool them.
You protect the legacy of the instrument by making mastery the only acceptable entry fee.
Exactly.
This entire conversation, this journey through Primrose's philosophy, reveals that playing the viola is an act of profound synthesis.
It really is.
If you're going to survive the transition, if you're going to come to the viola via the violin, you have to bring the athletic dexterity of Wieniawski with you. But you must leave your frantic vibrato and your skating bow arm at the door.
You have to rewrite your physical habits.
You have to intellectually map a new clef while physically negotiating with a heavy, unstandardized, recalcitrant piece of wood that fights your right arm every time you try to pull a sound out of the C string.
It's a lifelong challenge.
You have to commit to a lifetime of problem solving. You must join the fraternity, embrace the lofty goals of tone production, and never look backward.
As we conclude this analysis, there's one final overarching paradox worth considering.
Lay it on us.
Throughout this text, we have detailed the absolute chaos of the viola. Its size fluctuates wildly, creating ergonomic nightmares. Its strings constantly fight each other for acoustic dominance.
The Sleeping Princess and all that.
That's right. Its central clef requires intense mental gymnastics, and its practitioners are largely a patchwork of converts who began their musical lives on a different instrument. By every metric of modern efficiency, the lack of standardization in the viola world is a massive disadvantage compared to the uniformity of the violin.
It seems like a huge handicap.
Yet, what if this inherent recalcitrance is not a flaw, but the instrument's greatest artistic asset? What if the constant, grueling struggle to physically master a compromised box, the necessity of solving complex acoustic puzzles every time you encounter a new piece of wood, is exactly the crucible required to forge the deep, studious, intellectually superior musicians that Primrose so deeply respected? The viola does not simply attract superior taste. The struggle to conquer its unstandardized nature is precisely what creates it.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. A Viola Studio production.